The air inside the arena was electric long before the first note of the choir swelled. It was the kind of atmosphere that felt staged, polished, almost too bright to be holy. Spotlights swept across the massive crowd, beams of gold and white catching sequins on dresses, the sheen of suits, and thousands of hands lifted high in anticipation. Cameras rotated slowly on cranes above the sea of faces, ready to broadcast not just an event, but a spectacle to millions of living rooms across the country. The orchestra's music thundered, layered with the powerful harmonies of a full choir, while ushers guided stragglers into rows that were already vibrating with expectation. The smell of perfume mixed with faint popcorn from concession stands, the heat of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, rising like steam. On stage, dressed immaculately in white with a flowing jacket that moved as dramatically as his arms, stood Benny Hinn. He was in his element. Every gesture seemed rehearsed, every pause a performance designed to stretch anticipation. His voice carried easily, not just through the microphone, but through practiced resonance, the kind that made each syllable sound anointed. He strode from one side of the platform to the other, tossing his jacket back, calling out phrases that sent sections of the crowd to their feet. His words were part scripture, part theater, delivered with the confidence of a man used to controlling the very air of the room. But tonight, something was different. In the front row, near the aisle, sat a figure who didn't belong to this world of music and miracles. Chuck Norris was easy to spot, not because he demanded attention. If anything, he tried to shrink into the seat, but because his stillness contrasted against the fevered energy of everyone around him. While others swayed with eyes closed, hands lifted, Chuck sat with arms folded, posture straight, gaze calm. No jacket of bright white, no halo of light, just a quiet presence in a simple shirt. Whispers moved through the audience like sparks racing along a fuse. That's him, Chuck Norris. What's he doing here? Phones rose discreetly, some not so discreetly, as faces turned away from the stage to capture the legend in their midst. A boy tugged at his father's sleeve and pointed, eyes wide as if seeing a comic book hero suddenly alive. A group of teenagers laughed nervously, one of them mouthing, "No way he's real." For Benny, it was an opportunity. His eyes caught Chuck's presence almost immediately, and though he didn't acknowledge it at first, there was a glimmer behind his smile. A performer recognizing a new prop on stage, even if that prop hadn't agreed to play along. He lifted his hands higher, called for the crowd to repeat after him, and the arena thundered with obedient echoes. Yet between chants, his gaze flickered again toward the front row. It didn't take long. "Tonight," Benny said, drawing out the word until the choir's volume dropped, to let him command silence. "Tonight is not just any night. This is a night of power." His hand swept dramatically toward the rows of cameras. "Even men of earthly strength come to witness the true strength of the Lord." The audience followed his gesture, and hundreds of eyes landed squarely on Chuck. A wave of murmurs rippled through the seats. Some clapped, some gasped, some laughed with the same nervousness that had filled the teenagers a moment before. Benny smiled wider, tilting his chin slightly. "Even the great Chuck Norris is here with us. The world knows him for fists and kicks. But what is the might of a man compared to the might of the Spirit?" The line landed perfectly with half the crowd. Applause rolled like thunder, joined by laughter from those who felt the jab was harmless fun. But not everyone was laughing. Older men and women, those who had grown up with Chuck as a symbol of something greater than movies, shifted in their seats, their faces tightening. To them, the remark wasn't playful. It was patronizing. Cameras panned quickly, finding Chuck's reaction. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply looked at Benny with steady eyes that betrayed nothing but patience. His silence cut sharper than any comeback. The sudden quiet that followed was heavier than the applause. Even Benny felt it. For a fraction of a second, his rhythm faltered. He filled the space with another booming phrase, but the weight of that silence lingered like smoke after fireworks. Somewhere high in the rafters, a woman whispered audibly, "He doesn't look amused." And though her words were swallowed by the choir's swelling return, others thought the same. Chuck shifted only once. He unfolded his arms, rested his hands on his knees, and leaned forward slightly. It was such a small movement, but it sent a visible shiver through the audience. Suddenly, it seemed he wasn't just a guest watching the show. He was part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. The air thickened. Every gesture from Benny grew grander, every line louder, but his eyes darted toward Chuck more often now. And every time Chuck's stillness seemed to answer louder than applause. By the time the first prayer began, the noise of the crowd had softened into something sharper, more anticipatory. Thousands bowed their heads, but their eyes opened halfway, stealing glances at the silent figure near the front. The cameras caught it, too, lingering close-ups of Chuck's expressionless face juxtaposed against Benny's theatrics on stage. And then, when Benny raised both arms for a moment of collective silence, something strange happened. The arena obeyed. The choir faded. The orchestra hushed. And in the heavy quiet, the presence of one man standing still felt louder than all the music before. "Just wondering. Where are you watching from? Write it down. Bellow." Benny didn't waste the silence. He bent it to his will. He stepped forward, robe flowing, voice climbing with the confidence of a man who had turned pauses into theater long ago. "This night will be remembered," he declared. "This is the night when power reveals itself to the doubters, when even men who built their names on fists must bow before the Spirit." The audience responded like a single organism. One half erupted into applause, cheers rolling from the rafters down to the stage. The other half hesitated. Some looked toward Chuck, expecting him to stand, to fire back, to at least smile in acknowledgement. But he didn't move. He sat with the same calm posture, hands folded lightly, gaze fixed not on Benny, not on the cameras, but somewhere unshakably inward. It was that stillness that unsettled the room. Benny fed on reactions, gasps, laughter, shouts of "Amen!" But Chuck offered none. His silence became its own kind of speech. The cameras cut back and forth, Benny's wide, sweeping gestures, his words spilling like a preacher at war with shadows, then Chuck's face, impassive, unreadable, framed by the halo of stage lights. That contrast itself was a story, one the networks knew would spread before the night was over. Benny pressed harder. "They say he is a man of strength, a warrior, a champion on the screen. But tell me, what is muscle against faith? What is discipline against the fire of God?" He raised a hand dramatically and spun toward the crowd, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Even Chuck Norris is here tonight because he knows the Spirit is greater than the flesh." The crowd split in two. Younger voices laughed, clapping and shouting Benny's words back at him. But older faces in the audience frowned, their hands resting on their laps, unwilling to join the mockery. A few even shouted Chuck's name in defiance. The sound clashed in the air, one chant for Benny, one murmur for Chuck, like two tides colliding. Chuck finally shifted. He unfolded his arms, rose slowly to his feet. The simple act was enough to silence half the arena. The cameras caught every frame, the way he stood straight but not aggressive, the faint creak of the floor microphones picking up his movement, the quiet intensity of a man who didn't need noise to be heard. Benny, sensing the attention slip, raised his mic and laughed. "Ah, yes, he rises. He wants to feel what true power is." He spread his arms like he was welcoming Chuck onto the stage, but there was no warmth in it. It was a dare dressed as hospitality. The crowd roared. Some shouted encouragement, others jeered. Phones lit up like fireflies as thousands of recordings began simultaneously. Chuck took a single step toward the stage, then another, unhurried, deliberate. No one spoke. The orchestra, sensing the moment, fell silent. Even the choir waited. When he reached the steps, he stopped. He didn't grab the microphone Benny extended. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he looked at Benny with that steady calm and said, barely above a murmur, "Real strength isn't what you put on display. It's what you hold when no one's watching." The words were soft, but the arena carried them. The microphones picked up just enough, and the crowd inhaled sharply. For the first time, Benny didn't laugh. His face tightened for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the cameras to capture. Somewhere in the upper rows, a woman stood and clapped once, sharply. Others followed, hesitant but growing. The sound of divided applause filled the space, jagged and uneven, as if the crowd couldn't decide which truth it wanted to believe. Benny tried to cut through the noise. He raised both hands, calling, "Yes, yes!" But watch as the Spirit proves itself greater than words. Watch as we pray together and see who holds the true strength. His voice cracked slightly at the end, a rare slip masked quickly by another dramatic flourish. Chuck didn't answer. He simply held Benny's gaze for a long moment, then gave the faintest nod, as if agreeing to walk into the trap, knowing it was a trap. The crowd roared again, half in triumph for Benny, half in anticipation for Chuck. The cameras caught every angle. Benny with his microphone lifted like a sword. Chuck standing calm, shoulders relaxed, a living rebuke to theatrics. Between them, the silence pressed down harder than the lights overhead. They stood together under the white heat of the stage lights, Benny with the microphone raised like a scepter, Chuck with his arms resting loosely at his sides. The arena had fallen into a hush that felt heavier than the choir's music. It wasn't silence so much as suspension. Thousands of people waiting to see which man would move first. Benny broke it. "Let us pray," he boomed, sweeping his arm wide. The choir swelled behind him in a practiced drone, the orchestra shifting into a slow, rolling chord that suggested inevitability. He turned in a slow circle, drawing the crowd into rhythm. "Tonight we will see power revealed. Tonight even the strongest among us will bow before the Spirit." The people obeyed, arms lifted, eyes shut, voices echoed back with amens. The air smelled of sweat and perfume, the heat of bodies thickening under the lights. Benny's cadence rose and fell like theater, each pause calculated, each gesture slicing through the atmosphere. Chuck didn't join. He bowed his head slightly and spoke words too soft for the microphones. His lips moved, but no one could hear them except maybe the man a seat away. The cameras zoomed close, trying to steal a line, but they captured only stillness, the quiet focus of a man who seemed to pray for himself rather than for spectacle. The contrast was undeniable. Benny's voice rolled like thunder, calling down fire, commanding chains to break, filling the room with noise and urgency. Chuck stood motionless, whispering into air so private that it seemed untouchable. For half the audience, Benny's roar carried them into tears and raised hands. For the other half, Chuck's silence drew their eyes tighter, as if the absence of performance was the point. Benny pressed harder, his voice now pitched directly at the fighter beside him. "Strength of man is nothing. Muscle, fame, movies. What are they against the Spirit?" He pointed, smiling with theatrical warmth that felt closer to a challenge than an invitation. "Even Chuck Norris is here because he knows the Spirit is greater than the flesh." Applause erupted, but not evenly. Younger voices laughed, clapping with glee. Older ones sat stiff, uncomfortable. A chant of "Jesus" rose from one section. Another, quieter, murmured, "Chuck." The sound clashed in the rafters, messy, divided. Chuck finally lifted his eyes. He didn't take the microphone Benny extended, didn't match volume with volume. He said only one line, low but clear enough for the arena mics to catch. "Real strength isn't what you show to others. It's what you hold when no one's watching." The sentence cut through the room sharper than any shout. The laughter stopped. The applause thinned. Even Benny's practiced grin faltered. For the first time all night, his rhythm cracked. Trying to recover, he pulled Chuck into the performance. "Then pray with me, brother. Let the people see where your strength lies." He raised both arms toward the crowd, calling them to stretch out their hands. 1,000 palms turned toward the stage like sunflowers, voices rising again in collective urgency. Chuck didn't lift his arms. He nodded once, a gesture that was neither agreement nor refusal, and kept whispering words too soft for capture. The cameras showed the split screen. Benny's face lit with strain, microphone high, Chuck's lips moving in prayer no one could record. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some wept, convinced something holy was unfolding. Others exchanged glances, sensing the tension beneath the pageantry. The air thickened until even the choir's steady hum felt fragile. Benny leaned closer, eyes locked on Chuck. Into the mic he cried, "Let him feel the spirit now." But Chuck answered with 3 words, audible only because the entire room leaned forward in perfect silence. "See me later." The effect was immediate. Benny blinked, caught off guard. For a split second, his body froze before the performer in him pushed forward, turning the pause into theater. "Yes!" he shouted, voice cracking at the edge. "Later we will speak, but now the Spirit moves through this house." The choir rose to full power, drums rolling, horns blazing. The audience roared, hands lifted again. On stage, Benny raised his jacket high and swept it outward, his trademark flourish. People collapsed to their knees in the front rows, crying, recording, believing. Chuck simply lowered his head again, finishing his private prayer with no gesture, no bow. When the music climaxed, he stepped back into the shadows of the stage, leaving Benny alone under the lights. The show closed in triumph. The cameras cut to wide shots of thousands weeping and clapping. Benny's smile returned, bright and untouchable. But as he walked off stage later, jacket clutched in his hands, his breath came shallow. The chants of the crowd faded into the corridor's sterile white walls, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of silence heavier than applause. That night, in his hotel room, the noise of the city humming beyond the thin curtains, Benny dreamt. In the dream, the arena was empty, the lights gone, the microphone too heavy to lift. At the edge of the stage stood a figure, silent, immovable. Benny called out, "Show me your power!" The figure turned, but its face was water, a mirror reflecting only Benny's own. He woke with his heart racing, sweat soaking the collar of his shirt. The clock read 3:17. For the first time in his ministry, he felt unsure whether the voice that answered him on stage was truly the Spirit, or just the echo of his own performance. And with that came a question he couldn't escape. What had Chuck's whisper stirred inside him, that even his dreams now bent under its weight? The night did not end for Benny when the applause faded. Hours later, in a hotel room chilled by relentless air conditioning, he woke abruptly, his body drenched in sweat that clung to his collar and dampened the sheets. His pulse hammered as if he had been running, though he had not moved. For a moment, he didn't breathe. The dream had been too vivid, too sharp, its images still painted on the backs of his eyelids. He fumbled for the lamp, flooding the room with a sterile yellow glow that made the space feel even lonelier. A half-open Bible lay on the nightstand, its pages bent from careless handling. His hands shook as he reached for the leather-bound notebook he sometimes used for sermon ideas. Tonight, it became something else entirely. He scrawled quickly, his writing jagged and uneven. Arena. Empty. No choir. No music. Just me. He paused, heart pounding, then added, "He came." Chuck, his voice, like judgment. Without truth, strength crumbles. He set the pen down, but couldn't stop himself from rereading the words, as if anchoring them on paper would stop them from dissolving into the air. They didn't. The images returned with clarity that frightened him. In the dream, he had stood in the same vast arena he knew so well, but the seats were empty, the lights dim. No sound, no choir, no cameras, just silence, and the hollow echo of his own footsteps. He had looked out over the deserted rows and felt smaller than he ever had on stage, smaller than he thought possible. Then Chuck appeared, not entering, not introduced, just there, standing in the center of the ring of seats, solid as if he had grown from the concrete itself. He didn't move, yet his presence filled the arena more completely than the roar of 10,000 people ever had. Benny remembered trying to speak, trying to perform as he always did, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came. The microphone in his hand was dead weight, too heavy to lift, slipping from his grasp to the floor where it landed without a sound. He bent to retrieve it, but it dissolved like smoke under his fingers. Then came the voice. Chuck's voice, but deeper, slower, not carried by lungs but by the very air of the place. Without truth, strength crumbles. The words had crushed him like a verdict. They were not shouted, not violent, but absolute. In the dream, he had looked for his reflection on the giant screens above, but they were dark. He turned instead to a mirror that had appeared on the stage's edge, a mirror tall as a doorway. He stepped toward it and froze. The man looking back was not the man he knew. His face was pale, eyes sunken, mouth curved into a smile that felt false even to him. His hands trembled, clutching at nothing. He whispered his own sermon lines, but they sounded hollow. He reached out to touch the reflection, and the glass rippled like water. For a heartbeat, the man in the mirror was no longer him, but a stranger he couldn't name. That was when he woke. Now, in the cold hotel room, Benny stared at the notebook again. He closed it with a snap, but the sound seemed too loud, bouncing off the bare walls. His throat was tight, his chest aching not from exhaustion, but from something more dangerous. Doubt. For years, his fear had been losing the crowd, losing the applause that kept his ministry alive. But tonight, for the first time, the fear was different. It wasn't about losing people. It was about losing meaning. If the dream was more than imagination, if those words carried weight beyond his own conscience, then what was he really standing on? By morning, his closest aides noticed the change. He was quieter, slower to joke, slower to demand rehearsals. During breakfast, when one of them laughed about how the crowd had reacted to Chuck's silence, Benny only stirred his coffee, eyes unfocused. Someone asked if he was all right. He nodded, but the gesture was mechanical. Throughout the day, he drifted. During rehearsals, he gave less direction, speaking in half-sentences. He carried the notebook everywhere, fingers brushing the cover as if afraid it might vanish. When he looked in mirrors, in the dressing room, in the bathroom of the venue, he paused too long, searching his own face with suspicion, as though the stranger from the dream might reappear. That night, before stepping back on stage, his assistant adjusted his collar and whispered, "You look pale, Pastor." Benny forced a smile but said nothing. Behind the smile, his mind replayed the line over and over. Without truth, strength crumbles. The orchestra thundered, the lights blazed, the choir lifted its first note. But Benny's heart wasn't in the music. He felt the weight of silence pressing harder than the sound. And when he walked out to meet the crowd, his smile reached no further than his lips. By the following week, the dream had not left him. If anything, it seemed to follow him, clinging to the edges of his waking hours. Each time he tried to prepare a sermon, the words blurred on the page, replaced by that same sentence, as though it had carved itself into his mind. Without truth, strength crumbles. But the world outside wasn't letting him forget either. By Monday morning, clips of the service with Chuck had spread everywhere. Short videos cut to slow motion, the camera lingering on Chuck's silent lips while Benny thundered into the microphone. The captions varied, some reverent, others mocking. "This is what real strength looks like." Or, The preacher beaten by silence. He scrolled late into the night, reading thousands of comments. Some defended him fiercely, but others cut deep, accusing him of theatrics, of faking miracles, of building an empire on spectacle. Chuck said more without words than Benny did with an orchestra. One headline read. At breakfast with his staff, the tension showed. They tried to laugh it off, to remind him that controversy kept attention high. Don't worry, one said, buttering toast too cheerfully. People will forget in a week. We'll come back bigger, louder, just give them a show. But Benny didn't laugh. He pushed the food away and murmured, "And if it's not supposed to be a show?" The table fell quiet. No one knew how to answer. When Sunday arrived, the arena was packed as always. The lights, the choir, the cameras, all ready for another flawless performance. But the moment Benny stepped onto the stage, something was wrong. He launched into his familiar rhythm, but his voice trembled on the first verse. His sentences broke, syllables sticking in his throat. Words that had once flowed effortlessly now felt like stones dragged across his tongue. He tried to summon the energy, raising his arms, gesturing as always. Yet the people in the front rows leaned closer, not out of awe, but confusion. They could hear the stammer in his rhythm. His timing faltered. The choir tried to fill the gaps, but the dissonance only exposed the cracks further. And then he saw him. Chuck, seated halfway back, not in the front, not in a place of honor, just among the crowd. No cameras pointed to him at first, but people noticed. A ripple moved through the arena. Some whispered, others craned their necks. His stillness was magnetic. He sat with his hands folded, eyes fixed on Benny. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply watched. Benny felt his throat seize. He lost his line mid-sentence. A murmur spread across the arena as silence stretched too long. He forced out another phrase, but it came thin, almost pleading. Somewhere in the upper seats, a man stood abruptly and walked out. A woman followed, then another. Their footsteps echoed louder than the amplified choir. Benny's eyes darted after them, panic flickering across his face. He tried to regain rhythm, but the words betrayed him, tangling into each other. The cameras caught everything. The close-up revealed sweat beading at his temple, his jaw tightening, his hands gripping the microphone too hard. Commentators on local radio the next day would describe it as the first time they had ever seen him look human, vulnerable, unsteady, stripped of control. In the control booth, his production team whispered urgently, debating whether to cut to a pre-recorded clip. His aides backstage exchanged nervous glances, but Benny pressed on, voice cracking, body stiff, clinging to the routine like a drowning man to driftwood. And all the while Chuck sat unmoving, his presence heavier than any orchestra. Afterward, backstage, his team surrounded him. They insisted the answer was to double down, to plan an even grander display next time. More music, more theatrics, more spectacle. They spoke of lighting cues, special effects, a new media campaign. Their words swirled like noise around him. He interrupted them with a whisper, so faint they almost didn't hear. What if it's true? The room fell silent. What if everything I've built is just a stage? He asked, eyes fixed on the floor. No one responded. The air thickened with unease. That night, he sat alone, watching the replay of the service. He studied his own face on the giant screen, the forced smile, the faltering voice, the hands that trembled around the microphone. He didn't see the confident leader millions adored. He saw the reflection from his dream, a man who had been speaking for years, but perhaps not saying anything real. When the camera panned across the crowd and landed briefly on Chuck, Benny paused the video. He stared at that still frame, the calm, the focus, the absence of performance. He whispered aloud, "Why does silence feel stronger than my voice?" For the first time in decades, he felt not like the man with answers, but the man with questions. And that question, the one he couldn't escape, was what awaited him next Sunday, when he would stand before thousands again. Would he choose the theater or the truth? The following Sunday arrived with unusual weight. Hours before the service began, the arena filled to capacity. Families pressed close, children clutching programs, older couples murmuring prayers. Reporters hovered near the aisles, waiting to capture a headline moment. Everyone sensed something would happen, though no one knew what. Backstage, Benny faced the mirror. He had done so countless times, but tonight the reflection unsettled him. No makeup could hide the shadows under his eyes. His tie hung slightly crooked. He didn't fix it. For years, he had perfected appearances. Tonight, he let the imperfection remain. When the orchestra began, the sound thundered as always, but Benny didn't rush onto the stage. He waited. The choir stretched their notes, uncertain. Finally, he walked out, not with a flourish, not with raised arms, but slowly, as though stepping into a courtroom rather than onto a platform. The crowd erupted, but he didn't raise his hands for applause. He lifted the microphone and waited until the noise settled. The silence was thick, almost uncomfortable. Cameras zoomed in. His eyes looked clearer than they had in years. He began not with a booming declaration, but with a confession. "For a long time," he said, voice low, "I fought for your claps more than for the truth." A ripple moved through the audience. Some gasped, others leaned forward. No choir swelled behind him, no strings carried his words. It was just his voice, plain and unadorned. He told them about the dream, the empty arena, the stranger in the mirror, the sentence that would not leave him. Without truth, strength crumbles. He admitted he had been shaken, not by any man, but by what he saw within himself. The arena was utterly still. No coughs, no shuffling, only listening. For the first time, the silence served him rather than exposed him. Then his eyes found Chuck in the crowd. This time the cameras followed. People gasped as the screens showed him seated among them, watching intently. Benny paused, then continued. "Some of you come here for miracles, some for spectacle. But tonight, I have no show. Only this. I don't want theater anymore. I want truth." The words hung in the air. For several seconds, no one reacted. Then, slowly, a man in the front row stood. He didn't cheer. He simply placed a hand over his chest. Another followed. Then a woman near the back rose to her feet. Soon dozens, then hundreds, then thousands stood, not clapping wildly, but rising in quiet acknowledgement. Benny lowered the microphone, overwhelmed. For once, he didn't try to control the moment. He let it breathe. And then, quietly, Chuck rose. He walked down the aisle with no hurry. The cameras tracked him. When he reached the stage, he didn't take the microphone or speak. He simply extended his hand. Benny hesitated, then clasped it. The handshake was brief, firm, untheatrical. Yet in that simple gesture, the arena erupted. Not with laughter or staged awe, but with something raw, genuine. For years, Benny's services had ended with dramatic falls and swelling music. Tonight, it ended with silence and a handshake. He lifted the microphone once more, his voice almost breaking. "This is the beginning. I don't know where it leads, but I know this. Truth first, everything else after." The crowd stood, many with tears, some confused, others relieved. It wasn't unanimous, but it was real. Later, as the lights dimmed and people filed out, the lingering question remained, not of what Chuck had whispered that night, nor of how Benny had stumbled, but of what would come next. Could he rebuild on honesty alone? The cameras cut as the image froze on Benny and Chuck standing side by side, not rivals, but two men whose silence had spoken louder than the choir ever could. And the audience, those in the arena, those watching at home, were left with a final question echoing in their minds. When the lights fade, what is stronger, the performance, or the truth?